Welcome to the Faith is Not Blind podcast. I'm Eric Devonier, and I'm here today with Ben Winfrey. How you doing, Ben?
I'm good.
Good to see you. Ben, would you take a few minutes and just introduce yourself to our listeners?
Oh yeah, sure. I grew up in Rexburg, Idaho for most of my life. I moved there when I was 9 years old, and I was raised in a religious home. Both of my parents are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I don't know. I've always kind of known God was there, as far as background.
Yeah.
As far as gray area goes for me, that really wasn't ever a part of it. I've always known God was there.
Yeah.
Just didn't know anything about Him. That was kind of my background.
Yeah. So currently too, right? You're a college student.
Mm-hmm.
What's your major?
Manufacturing engineering technology.
Okay. Great. And so that's some of your background. You're now in college, recently back from a mission, and then you're describing your early life that you knew God was there. Mm-hmm. But then, what was the part that you said that you weren't sure about?
So, I don't know. I never really knew anything about Him. I mean, I did grow up in a religious home that taught me about God. They taught me His characteristics. I mean, my lack of knowledge in that regard wasn't because of any lack of teaching. I definitely had been taught a set number of things to believe about God, but I didn't know any of that for myself. Yeah. I knew enough about His nature to know that He existed. He definitely was involved in my life. That was pretty undeniable to me. But as far as anything past that, as far as like whether or not He loved me, that was pretty well a mystery for most of the time. Especially when my sureness of His love was tested. Then I realized I really needed to know more about that.
Yeah. So you kind of had like this seed, right? This portion of some kind of knowledge, knowing that He's there, but you also weren't sure what the implication of all of that was, and
right.
Specifically for you.
Mm-hmm. So
how did the understanding of the implication of His existence? How did you understand that in your life?
He answered prayers in stark ways that would have been impossible for me to ignore. Yeah. Especially early on in my life, like in elementary school. I don't know. Looking back now, I realize that like I kind of was really aware of like wanting Him to answer prayers when I was a really little kid, like in elementary school. Yeah. But at first, when I remember, this is early memories, it seemed like He wasn't really answering them. But as I grew older, into like maybe middle school and junior high, not that much older, I started to recognize, maybe because I was keenly aware of wanting Him to answer prayers, I'm not sure, but I started to become very aware that He was answering my prayers. And in ways, like I said before, that I really couldn't ignore. It was almost it seemed uncharacteristic from what I had been taught. Like, you know, I'd always heard that like prayers would be answered in God's own time and stuff like that. But there were times where I would pray for something and then it would happen, like that day. And it would be so specific that it couldn't have been coincidental.
Right. And you know, you said too, so you're having these experiences, but you also said too that you were praying and wanting to feel more of God's love for you specifically, and that you said sometimes that sometimes that feeling of love or the sureness of it was tested.
Right.
Yeah. So what's an example? Like, what do you mean by having that feeling tested?
So that comes in when I was a little older, actually more recent. When I was about, let's see, 16 or 17, the weight of life kind of settled. The realization that, hey, like eventually I should, I'll need to move out. I'll need to sustain myself. I'll need
Yeah.
to like get an education, to maybe support a family. Those implications, they were heavy to me.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the beginning of a really big shift in my life, when I didn't really know what I thought I knew. And there was a lot, I don't know really what to share, but there was a lot of personal things that happened. Some failed relationships, and I don't know. I had a few friends that were really close to me that had previously been very active in their faith, but decided to deviate from that. In some cases, to completely abandon it.
Yeah.
And some of those people, and this was sort of progressive from age
Sure.
16 through age 20.
Yeah.
And by the time I was age 20, I was actually dating a girl that I thought I might marry, and I really loved her. And that happened to her as well. She kind of just left
Wow.
it all behind, and it was at that moment when essentially I was told that believing what I believed was foolish. And it was then that I really had to like evaluate what I believed, what I knew. It was kind of a crossroads.
Yeah.
And that was really where I had to choose. That was where a lot of pivotal moments happened.
Well, yeah, I mean, just talking about, I think, if I know the chronology right, just from listening, that you begin to feel kind of the weight of the world, this sort of recognition, I'm going to move out of my parents' house, I've got to be an adult. So this is happening on one level, and you're thinking about the church, and you're thinking about, the implication of God's existence for you.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, progressively, you're having friends that are going the opposite direction.
And synonymously, it gets progressively more difficult to obey the commandments.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So how, like during that time period, what did you lean on to try to get you through all of that? Because you did, you ended up serving a mission, right? And was it the Omaha, Nebraska mission?
Yep.
Right. So you served a mission. So we know that you got to that point, but how did you make it through all of those
What
years
was the
with
bridge?
the friends? Yeah, what was the bridge for you?
So it was when I was 19, I would say, with some friends making those choices and that girl making her choices. That was probably where it happened. And a big part of that was at that time in my life, independent of my friends, I just really wasn't going anywhere. I might have been 20, 19 or 20.
Yeah.
But at that point, I kind of thought it might be possible that I wouldn't serve a mission, because no matter what I could do, I just really couldn't get there.
Yeah.
To where I could go on a mission. And for a long time, I thought I would go, but it was like 6 months away. And then always 6 months away. And then all at once, kind of when all this stuff happened, I realized I might not go at all. And this is significant, this next part in my mental shift. A few things happened. I realized I was going nowhere in like all ways, like in career and education and spiritual matters, just.
Yeah.
And I wanted answers a little bit. And I really felt like if I didn't go on a mission, I knew I'd be failing myself and I'd be failing the people I might serve there. But more importantly, I knew that if I wasn't at least worthy to go to the temple, I would be failing the person I married. And that was inherently unacceptable, just like deep down. And I don't know why to this day, because at that time, I really didn't know what I believed. I just knew that I needed to have the most amount of respect for the person I marry. I didn't know who it was. And so I just knew that I needed to have that respect. And so my focus shifted from a mission towards more eternal things, towards the temple and towards my relationship with God directly. And
That's
when
really
things
it's
started
really
to change.
interesting, right? Because it's not so the mission is really it's a if we can say this, a side effect.
Oh yeah,
Right.
it's the frosting on the cake.
Right, because the focus
Yeah.
is on what's eternal, on what really matters, and that relationship with God, which is, I think, so central to any religious life. But it's so central to devotion that you were focused on those things, and that therefore the mission was a part of that, but it wasn't the focus.
Right. As soon as my focus shifted, focus shifted away from the mission as like the focus,
Yeah.
then everything changed. My focus fell on, a mission is important, but it fell on way more important things like eternal marriage and my relationship with God and things like that. And that was way more powerful, those things as a focus.
And so then from there you felt your testimony, your conversion grow. Is that fair to say?
There was actually another step to it. Part of it was, until that point, I never actually had engaged in active scripture study on my own, personal scripture study, consistently, ever. It was kind of a realization all at once. Like, all my church leaders are telling me, read, pray, go to church. Read, pray, go to church. And I was finding myself very frustrated because I had grown up reading the scriptures and grown up going to church and grown up praying. But I kind of realized it was kind of a moment of self-honesty that I hadn't actually done those things personally. I had done those things as a participant of a group. And it really doesn't work that way. You can't expect to just soak in a testimony from other people.
It has to be
God.
right. It has to be experienced, right? And something you just said too, right? Has to come from God.
Yeah.
And coming. So because it is that, it has to be engaged in, right?
Yeah.
So,
you have to make a choice.
So you do those things, and then you head off on your mission. At any point in your mission, were you like, oh boy, like what did I just do? I mean, did you feel like there were moments on your mission where you questioned your testimony or your conversion, or?
The answer to that question is actually probably in one more detail, in the build up towards my mission, and I think this really is what made probably the biggest difference out of everything. These were all like details that kind of led up to something that I did. Upon realizing all of these things, like my relationship with God, who are you, where are you, like I need you, pretty much. I was reading in the Book of Mormon actually, and I read in Moroni that I shouldn't doubt because I can't see. It says, doubt not because you see not. And then it literally says you receive no witness until after the trial of your faith. And I definitely was having a trial of faith. And then I realized, well, gee, it just has to happen after. It will come after. And I don't know why that scripture stood out to me so much, but it did. It made me almost seem wimpy for not waiting. And I was like, okay. And then in Alma, and I mentioned these scriptures because they were very significant at the time, and very significant still. He says, Alma talks a lot about the seed of faith, and you have to plant it, and it takes time, and it takes effort. You can't just sit there and expect faith to happen or anything.
Yeah.
And so with those two things in mind, I went to God, and it was the winter of 2015. And I told him, so I was 20 at the time, and I told him that for the first time in my life, I was actually committed to being obedient to everything, just to be obedient. And that included all the little things. That included reading my scriptures, specifically the Book of Mormon, every day. And I had never done that until then. And it included going to church and being on time. Just the little things that I knew I wasn't doing. I decided to commit to Him to do those things, to be obedient. I knew I wouldn't be able to do it on my own. And so I asked Him for help and asked for a return of, I don't know, something. I just needed something to know that He was actually engaged, at least a little bit. And so after, keep in mind, I didn't even go on my mission until, that was winter of 15. I didn't leave on my mission until August of 16. So almost a year later. And because that moment, that winter, when I knelt and I prayed and I told Him that I would just be obedient, that's really when everything changed. Was the willingness to just do it without really knowing what would happen. And but there was definitely a waiting involved. I wasn't just blindly doing something. I had a definite mindset about it, and I was very carefully following the direct counsel of what Alma teaches and what Moroni teaches. And so after a few months, it was like God's miracles just started for the first time. But what was crazy is He also gave me a remembrance of all the miracles that had happened in the past that I had missed. And that was a really, really cool experience to be able to be a part of that.
It serves as a reminder, right, that he's been there.
Yep.
Yeah.
There were a few moments during that time, that next 8 or 9 months, where my resolve to continue to do that, to be obedient, was really tested. But in those moments, I would always remember the promise I had made that previous winter. And with that, I was always given a perfect memory of all the things He had done for me. There were a few additional, very spiritual events that happened in that time that I can't ever erase. They're like totally burned into my memory. And so then, I don't know, sorry, that was a long answer to a short question.
That's really good. I mean, I think one thing that's really interesting about, that's all the stuff that sets up, I think, where you are now, and about your testimony and your conversion and your mission adds to those things. And I think it's interesting because you had said that you had done, some of those things about praying and reading in your scriptures, but here you are, in your late teens, early 20s, where you're choosing to do them, and how big of an impact that had on you. And so one of the things one of the questions that comes to mind as I listen to that is, what advice would you give, young people that are in the same situation that you're in? Like maybe they're in their late teens, their early 20s, feeling the weight of the world. They're worried about, just life itself, but then also worried about God. And maybe they have friends that are either, struggling in whatever way with their own religion or with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. What advice would you give to them?
The advice I might give, honestly, like the first advice I might give might be pretty unconventional, and maybe not very, especially in the culture of the church, it might not be very politically correct. Yeah. But the advice I'd give would be to not settle for an emotional experience when you could be having a spiritual experience. A lot of my friends, I saw them having an emotional experience and passing it off as a spiritual experience. But then what ended up happening was when their faith was really tested, they had nothing to lean back on.
So they had confused the emotional with the spiritual.
Yeah, and And when it was tested, those emotional experiences they had had in the past really were just exposed as what they were in their memory, as false. And so, as not true connections with God. I shouldn't say false, but not substantial. But that's not to say that a spiritual experience can't be emotional. It can be, but there is definitely distinct difference.
And how would you define that distinct difference?
It's not self-generated. It doesn't come from you or from your environment. It comes from God. That's all. You can only feel it. It's impossible to describe.
Yeah, impossible to describe, but it sounds like, Ben, that you might say something, but you can know it when you feel it.
Yeah.
And then one of the things you said too, I think, is your advice was don't settle.
Yeah.
Right? And so on some level that maybe we can experience, like you had said, that sometimes spiritual might involve the emotional,
right?
But that we shouldn't settle just for the emotional, but maybe to keep praying and to maybe keep doing some of the things that you had mentioned until we find something that we can say, this is not just emotional, but it's a
real.
spiritual witness.
Yeah, I mean, how many people, I don't know. I've seen a lot of my friends who really wanted to have a spiritual experience, and they settled for that emotional response, and then ended up later becoming very disillusioned because they felt like they had been duped. But
it's almost as if the emotional can be a kind of a confirmation bias. Right?
I guess so. I don't know.
For the spiritual, or something that's easier to get, but maybe is less enduring, less
permanent,
spiritual.
Yeah.
Wow. That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your experience, Ben. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.